Welcome back to Capitol Tonight. I'm Susan Arbetter. Democrats are getting heat for congressional lines that not only Republicans are calling gerrymandered, but groups like the liberal Brennan Center are calling a masterclass in gerrymandering. But Democrats, like my next guest, say the map makers were simply undoing decades of partisan redistricting. Gianaris is second in command in the New York State Senate and the head of LAT4, which is the group in charge of redrawing both congressional and legislative lines. Senator Gianaris, great to see you.
Thanks for having me, Susan.
I just have to ask this. When the IRC announced that it couldn't get its stuff together and they couldn't get the maps out, the Democrats in LAT4 got those maps out so fast. How was that possible?
Well, I think we work very closely with our colleagues in the Assembly, and nobody knows these districts like we do. We've been living with them for the last 10 years, and so we put a lot of hours in. The staff and civil servants at LAT4 put a lot of hours into it because we understood the very tight time frame we were under. We're basically at the deadline as you and I speak here today. Petitions start on March 1st. The boards of elections have told us they need about a month to get themselves together with the new lines before petitioning begins, so we're there.
Yeah, the legislature is voting on these maps right now. In response to questions about the maps, you have said that that New York has some very specific rules against gerrymandering. But, Senator, does it matter if the courts aren't willing to take the issue up? And the courts have been very hesitant to do that in the past.
Yeah, there has been a lot of deference, both at the federal and state levels. This year, the difference is we have a whole new set of standards that we have to comply with, but we have been incredibly careful. We've had our lawyers look at these maps backwards and forwards, and we're very confident that we've complied with all the rules. And when we get to court, as inevitably will be the case, happens every decade, we will make our case to the judiciary and are confident that these lines will stand.
All right, I'm going to get back to the court in a second, but you're not doing this in a vacuum. You know that every state in the nation is undertaking redistricting, and Republican-controlled states like Utah and South Carolina are aggressively expanding Republican control through redistricting. Did that notion play any role whatsoever in your map making?
Well, we're not ignorant of what's happening in other states and the national implications of what we're dealing with here, but we are prohibited from drawing maps for the purpose of benefiting a specific individual or a specific party, and our priorities were complying with the state constitution and statutory requirements, and we've done that here.
There is another concern that because many of these districts are now either a lot bluer or a lot redder than they were, candidates will be less focused on the general election. Incumbents will be less focused on the general election and more focused on the primary, which enhances polarization. Isn't that less small d Democratic?
Well, you're building a lot of assumptions into that question. And so, look,
I think they're good assumptions, though.
Well, we don't know. We can prognosticate about how competitive these maps will be. There's been a lot of talk of New York 11, and I happen to personally think that's still a competitive district. The voters have the final say on these things. And when we had lines that were influenced, some would say unduly, by the Senate Republicans who ran the Senate for every redistricting for almost 100 years, you ended up just piling Democrats into very few districts so that they would dilute that, and the competitive districts were ones that Republicans could compete in while they packed all the Democrats into other districts. So there will still be competitive districts in New York. There always have been, and there will be. But the most important thing is that we are drawing these maps in a way that these communities throughout the state can be represented properly, communities that have been chopped up and divided over time, in many instances to dilute the voting power of minority groups. The unraveling I keep talking about is undoing a lot of that. And for the congressional lines particularly, the last decade's lines were drawn by a judge, so those were better in that sense. But that was building on decades of partisan gerrymandering that formed the framework for what the judiciary did the last time. And so there was a lot of work to do just to make things fair. And so we shouldn't be comparing these maps to the maps that exist now, because the maps that exist now are not fair.
They've been very gerrymandered by the Republicans in this case.
Right, of course.
So let's just say that the Court of Appeals looks at these lines and says, yep, they are gerrymandered. What is next, and what would be the implications, Senator, of New York's primary elections, for New York's primary elections, which are in June and which candidates need to start petitioning for soon?
Yeah, well, the timing is an issue. I don't put myself in the seat of the judges that might hear these cases, but I think the Constitution, as I understand it, requires the legislature to get another crack at it if the courts decide that something was afoul of the requirements. But you're right. As I mentioned earlier, we are up against the clock right now. And so to the extent this process gets delayed and takes longer, it will affect the political calendar in ways that we can't predict right now.
Senator Mike Gianaris, he is the Deputy Senate Majority Leader and head of LAT4, which is the group in charge of drawing district lines every 10 years. Thank you again for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Susan.
Coming up, Jack Martins, Vice Chair of the Independent Redistricting Commission, shares his thoughts on the proposed maps. Stay with us.